you remember that many of the discussions were about for how long and how far we can squeeze the life of copper.
G-fast and all that. Yeah.
Correctly. So I think that is a major shift. Now nobody is talking about how long can we squeeze the life, or for how long we can squeeze the life of copper. Now it's more about when can we get rid of copper forever, and plans are made right now.
It's almost like they've finally thrown in the towel and gone, all right, we give in, the copper's dead.
It's almost how long can we squeeze the life of fibre?
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. This is a special podcast because we're on site for the first time in, it must be a couple of years at least. We're in Amsterdam.
City centre.
at the massive Rai. And we're here because we're at Broadband World Forum, which is, as the name implies, a trade show about broadband sector, and it's run by our employers, Informa. So we're kind of living the Informa dream. So I haven't even introduced our special guest. The other important part of this is that we've got special guest, Dario Talmesio, as he just taught me to pronounce properly.
Thank you.
And Dario is an analyst at Omdia, which is also part of Informa. So we've got the sort of Informa holy trinity here of event analyst and journalist.
The various Informa hats all represented here.
This is what it's supposed to be about. We're showing the way, man. Yeah. Stephen Carter's going to be like this. He's going to be showing it to everyone, like, this is how it's done. Give these people massive pay rises now.
I'm not sure I want to join this podcast.
I'm not going to start spending that cash just yet. So before we get starting talking about the show and stuff, it's good to reflect on the fact that we're all here together. It's good fun. I mean, one of the things that's come up, which we'll talk about, is how the lockdown, the pandemic and all that accelerated digital transformation, for want of a better word. Everything's got to be all digital, everyone's on Zoom and all that. But sometimes you can't beat just getting together. I've got to apologise to our sort of loyal podcast followers. We've got no beers today because it's like 11 in the morning here in Amsterdam. So we're just doubling down on the caffeine instead. We might start freaking out for over caffeine. But yeah, it's good to be here together. And the only downside is it's such a drag getting here, isn't it?
To the right.
No, just travelling.
Yeah, it is.
The amount of hoops you got to jump through. You got to get a COVID test to come out. You've got to have booked one for the second day when you come back.
You've got to be vaccinated, and then you find that your app doesn't get you into pubs in Amsterdam.
Yeah. Ian got the arsehole a bit last night when wouldn't let him into a pub.
Yeah.
And then you get a wristband every morning.
This is our wristband
to show that you actually have been vaccinated.
So basically, if you haven't got the COVID passport, because I really resist the COVID passport as an intrusion into my civil liberties, but it's just as well I am double vaccinated or I wouldn't be coming here at all.
Well, but you have to have the right COVID passport.
Apparently so. Yeah, all right, mate. Get over it now. I know it's traumatic for you.
We managed.
Yeah, we got there in the end. So here we are. Okay, so what are we going to chat about? We're going to talk about the event. Each of the three of us are going to talk. Dario was up presenting yesterday. I thought you did a great job there.
Thank you.
Working the crowd.
Thank you very much.
And Ian and I were just sat there in the front row writing it up. So we'll all have our takeaways from the event. And then other stuff that we've been writing about this week. I mean, the most read story on Telecoms.com was one that's sort of related. Nokia launched some new technology that does a better job with mmWave, which has basically been shite up until now. But because it's got really bad propagation characteristics.
It's good if you're standing next to the base station.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to be sat on it. I think that's sort of how you, when you're writing your analyst papers, you go, it's a bit shite, don't you?
It's not exactly the language. I think our editorial team would
they might have
paraphrase that into. There are some challenges in the market.
There are some challenges. That's analyst speak for shite. Fair enough. So we'll move on to that, and it's specifically they're thinking of using it in the area of fixed wireless access. So there's an overlap there between this show, and then we're going to finish off another story Ian and I both covered, I think, just before we came out here, which was Google's latest sort of cloud offering. No, it wasn't entirely for telcos, but definitely with a sort of telco sector.
That was one component.
Yeah, angle. And obviously it's a favourite topic of ours to bang on about hyperscalers and public cloud and all that sort of thing. So that's what we'll do. Right, we'll crack on. I will just recap. What did I write about? I sort of, apart from reflecting on how nice it is to have an event like this at all, I covered, they had two speakers on the keynote stage yesterday morning, both from BT. They had, was it Rob Shooter? Is that his name? Yeah, he's the head of CEO of BT Enterprise. And they had Howard Watson, who's the overall CTO. Yeah. And they were, it's fairly top-line stuff. They're only up there for about 15, 20 minutes, so they're never going to have too much of a deep dive. But they were kind of reflecting on the theme I just touched on earlier, on how the whole digital transformation journey has been accelerated by the lockdown. It's not just the fact that everyone's on Zoom and all that sort of thing, but it's things like payments. If you notice, loads of places just won't take cash now because they're worried that your Fiverr's got loads of coronavirus all over it. So everyone's trying to use contactless payments and all that sort of thing. And there's all these other little bits that seem to have... The process was already underway, but it seems to have accelerated the whole thing. So yeah, I mean, I'll pass it to you, Darry. Do you concur with BT's observations on that stuff?
Yeah, without doubt. We said it at the start of the pandemic that it was going to be an acceleration of existing trends, and the second part of that is not only is an acceleration of existing trends, but it will never go back exactly to where we were before, and we are
the new normal.
I'm glad you used that because nobody's...
No, I don't like it either.
Anymore.
That's why I said it with a sarky voice.
Yes, that was very provocative. As you can, only you can do.
He's about to swing at me.
But yes, I mean, we are in a hybrid world, and we are staying in a hybrid world. Even when we go back physical to the office, we are still logging into our Teams meetings or Zoom meetings, because this is where the documents are shared, the IM are shared, even though we are face to face with most of our colleagues. And that's just an example of hundreds of thousands of examples we can have. So there's no doubt we are not going back to the kind of analog world we were living before. And of course, that's a massive trigger for telecom companies to kind of rethink about their approach in infrastructure and services. And
do you think they are?
I think
they're rising to the challenge.
I mean, one of the most interesting messages that were there from BT, both from Howard Watson and Rob. Was it Rob?
Rob Shooter. Yeah.
Rob Shooter. Yeah. Apologies, Rob Shooter.
Sorry, we got there in the end.
Is the number of FTTP home pass they want to have in the next 5 years. It's a colossal job to move from 5 million to 25 million.
Yeah.
But it's
and they want that done by when? Is it end of 26 or something?
2026. And definitely it's a change. If you've been attending this event, Broadband World Forum, over the past few years, as I'm sure you have, as we all have, you remember that many of the discussions were about for how long and how far we can squeeze the life of copper.
G-fast and all that. Yeah.
Correctly. So I think that is a major shift. Now nobody is talking about how long can we squeeze the life, or for how long we can squeeze the life of copper. Now it's more about when can we get rid of copper forever, and plans are made right now.
It's almost like they've finally thrown in the towel and gone, all right, we give in, we got the copper's dead.
It's almost how long can we squeeze the life of fibre? I mean, but there was an interesting message from one of the vendors on the show about, and it also measures up with Omdia's forecasts about GPON itself. If you look at GPON spending over the next few years, it's going like that, because everybody's now having to move to the next kind of platform. That's obviously fibre based. It's not a case of digging up the street again and all that, but it's new equipment for an even higher speed technology, XGS PON, and then people are already starting to talk about the 25G PON and 50G PON battle, which I know Darrow feels really passionately about.
Absolutely.
I've got to admit, I'm almost totally ignorant on this. I know PON stands for Passive Optical Network.
Yeah, I mean, it's just souping it up, really. It's a similar thing that happens in mobile with the kind of, I mean, before we got to 5G, people were talking about 4.5G, weren't they? And then we had 4.9G, and I think some of the operators in America were even sort of trying to sort of brand it as 5G. But I mean, the PON, you know, the next step in the process basically is something called XGS-PON, which I think is 10 gigabit symmetrical, I think, sort of technology.
But the underlying fact of the physical rollout of fibre in the ground or whatever, that's not affected by it. It's just what technology you have at either end of the
and this is,
fibre.
I mean, that's an interesting thing for me, is that a lot of the investment challenges that are coming now, isn't it? You know, BT is not the only one. KPN was on the stage yesterday as well. I think they're doing 10,000 homes at the moment. I think they have like 3 million passed, and they're trying to get to 80% population coverage by 2020. Similar time frame to BT. I mean, they've got a joint venture. They're doing some of it within rural areas, but if you look at their capital expenditure, it's gone up massively. Free cash flow's down. So, it's not a message that investors are going to, you know, within KPN are happy about. But then again, if they don't do it, they'll just lose.
Yeah.
They'll just
you think
lose
investors would realise that the value of the company?
Well, I think they do
ultimately
realise, because if they don't do it, then companies like Eurofiber and Vodafone Ziggo are going to kind of clean up. So and they won't be able to support. They won't be able to support services, basically.
Of course, we started talking about BT, but let's not forget that on the stage there were plenty of alternative fibre operators from the UK market. So it's inevitable to think that there is obviously a bit of a competition push there, and not just, well, a bit is an understatement. There is some serious competition in the market at the moment, and therefore,
because Virgin's got theoretically more money behind it now that it's done the merger. City Fibre keeps getting cash off Goldman Sachs or someone.
And Virgin's big into fibre as well now. I mean, they've relied on a sort of cable platform, DOCSIS 3.0, and it was only a few weeks ago, I think they were saying that it's a bit later than BT, but by 2028, I think they want their whole network, which isn't quite as, it's not nationwide, but it's a lot, to be basically transitioned to fibre technology.
So the impression I got, and this was sort of verified by chatting to you, Ian, you were showing me a chart of the sort of growth of this stuff.
Yeah, well, that was Omdia forecast.
That was Omdia stuff. Okay, credit where it's due. We've been banging on about fibre forever. Everyone's known about fibre as a thing, but there seems to be quite a recent acceleration in the build-out.
Yeah.
And we reckon that one of the main drivers of that, funnily enough, is 5G, yeah?
Yeah, well, I mean, Dario's probably better talking about that. But, I mean, I did speak to some of Dario's colleagues, Julie Kunstler and Jamie Lenderman, who are here, and they were saying that one of the big drivers for sort of PON investment is kind of backhaul, really, for, you know, basically providing 5G transport.
It certainly is. 5G has been a catalyst for so many changes, and fair enough, it's early days from a consumer adoption, but we can see that it's happening. And I think as a kind of headline, we've heard yesterday time and time again, you can have fiber without 5G, but you will never have 5G without fiber.
Yeah.
So the two go hand in hand, but there is a dependency there. You will not have a good quality 5G if you don't deploy a good fiber.
And do we feel that has sort of improved the argument? Let's assume within all telcos there's an argument between the techies and the finance people about digging up the cash to invest in this stuff. Do we feel that the 5G era has given the techies a stronger argument to tell them to open their wallets a bit more for the investment?
I think it's 5G, but it's not just that. Let's not forget there is a reason to exist for fiber, which is the normal traditional customer sitting at home that is asking for a better connectivity. We talked quite a bit yesterday about service providers now offering gigabit broadband, and we had a panoramic overview of European operators offering gigabit broadband. It's quite a few now have it in their consumer services, and the take-up is obviously not the same as low-end or mid-range prices, but it's starting. And it's one of those things like, are there applications that require gigabit broadband? It's always kind of the chicken and egg type of discussion, but some customers don't have that discussion. Some customers just want to have the best that is out there, and they pay a little premium for it, which is one of the drivers.
I mean, KPN was saying that it's seen ARPU go up where when you move a customer from copper to fibre, which has always been one of those concerns, isn't it? Can we get people to spend more on broadband? But I think another compelling thing is that it's, you know, everybody these days talks about shutting down older platforms like 3G switch off should be a huge efficiency benefit because they can refarm that spectrum, can't they, and get rid of a lot of the kind of legacy stuff that they're still having to sort of maintain. And it's the same with fibre. It's just it's a bit like, you know, everybody says 5G is so much more efficient than 4G. It's a more efficient technology to run stuff on than copper. You can get rid of old legacy platforms. You can realise savings, and some of the figures that KPN was coming out with really, I mean, I have to sort of dig into them a bit more, but he was saying sort of over 60% maintenance cost savings.
That's it, I remember that slide,
they go from copper to fibre. So I suppose if they get this capital expenditure hurdle out of the way, then I mean, maybe we get to a point where, because all the capital intensity at the moment in the industry seems to be driven by either fibre or 5G rollout.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they're just going to stop investing, obviously, because we'll be talking about things like 6G and 50G PON, but there's a difference between that and having to go around and actually dig up. Everybody always says the civil engineering cost is one of the main things they have to bear.
But also there are different deployment models at the moment and different investment models. We had so many kind of capitalists yesterday essentially pitching for their services.
Yeah.
Saying,
Well, that's the other big change, isn't it? I think
it is.
It's understanding among the capital community and private equity about this, and they all of a sudden see it as an attractive asset they want to be involved in now.
They were there on the panel, essentially pitching. Like, come with me. I'll invest in your business or your alternative business, which is very indicative of the fact that it's not just it's not just 5G that is driving. Fiber is not just consumer demand that is driving fiber. It's a different way of investing in it. It's a different approach to it that is driving the kind of the deployment. And the Fibrecos are happening. We have seen quite a few established service providers are now kind of co-deploying or co-investing. And in some cases, the service provider is not even investing; is an alternative operator investing in the infrastructure. So that is changing.
Well, we talked a bit about this yesterday, didn't we?
Yeah,
We've seen operators spin off their towers quite a lot now. That's become a real trend, and the emergence of towercos in Europe. But the next step seems to be a move to a sort of Fibrecos model. And I mean, there's the Telecom Italia, as you'll know, has been talking about what to do with its fixed line assets for ages, hasn't it? And it always sort of runs into problems because it wants to retain control of it. But I can see a point when you get operators just going totally asset light and having almost no infrastructure at all.
And so there'd be a Fibrecos that just owns the fibre infrastructure.
So the same way that someone owns the towers, someone owns the ducts and poles, and a bit like a City Fibre, you know.
Right.
I mean, is City Fibre a Fibrecos? I don't know. Kind of is, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of private equity backed, isn't it? Or it's
what is it? Their CEO doesn't like being called an altnet or something like that.
No, he doesn't.
Thinks it's a bit diminishing of what they're all about.
You can't call them a service provider. They're not that either because they don't sell to end customers. But
how does he call himself?
I don't know why he refers to himself. Actually,
that's a good point. He just knows what he doesn't want to be called. It's like, narrow it down for us, mate. Okay. I think that investment thing's interesting because this could be unfair of me, but I normally think of private equity sort of investor types as quite impatient, whereas the capital you've got to put into a Fibrecos, it's got to be pretty patient capital, isn't it?
But there are infrastructure funds that operate that model. They plan for the long term and they want a steady. They see fibre as like a steady, safe bet. That's always going to offer returns.
It's probably quite a good part of a portfolio. If you've got more volatile stuff, and you got that in there, it's going to go up. It's like buying a house or something, isn't it?
Yeah. So
also, I think service providers have been quite good at kind of exposing the different elements of their businesses, where there is long-term value, where there is long-term opportunity, and where the risk is. Now, if you listen to all service providers, they are all calling themselves a technology business. We are not just selling connectivity. We are a technology company, which is fair enough, but technology comes with a different type of risk compared to infrastructure. So what they did is they carve out the infrastructure and said, this is this steady, reliable, predictable, maybe not high growth, but this is what we have for the very long term. And some investors like that. Other investors prefer the operational risk. Maybe fewer investors often prefer the operational risk. But what service provider did is like to expose the different identity essentially of their assets.
Yeah, there's a few of them sort of banding this term around techco, isn't there? Moving from being a telco to a techco.
So BT said it, Vodafone's been saying it.
I mean, I'm not the only one that's sort of dubious about that model, really. I mean, you hear it being
it's an
talked
aspiration,
about. It's an
it?
aspiration, but there's still very little signs that they do anything very compelling in that regard to me. I mean, revenues are still driven by connectivity, and all this talk about new service offerings is still just talk.
At least they've stopped saying DevOps so often.
I'm sure there are examples,
that.
but there aren't many examples, are there, of success models in that area.
Well, it's a hell of a sort of culture transition to do. I mean, we always say that operators are largely, whether they like it or not, and they won't thank us for saying it, they're kind of utilities.
Yeah.
And going from being a utility to being some kind of whizzy Silicon Valley fail fast kind of setup is a hell of a cultural transition.
Well, it is, and then everybody's going to be sceptical about it anyway, because one other thing that's happened during the pandemic is the big US tech giants just becoming even stronger. It's not just telecom they're affecting; they're sort of chewing into all sectors really, and you sort of think, how can anybody without those resources really mount a serious challenge now?
Yep. Before I move it on, I'll give both of you a quick opportunity to flag up anything else you spotted while you've been here. I don't know if this is what you want to mention, but you wrote an interesting story based on you chatting to the BT guy yesterday.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tangent, but I just asked him about the Huawei thing again, because you sort of have to, don't you? And I mean, everybody knows in the UK they're having to swap out the...
Yeah, and he mentioned it in his...
He did, yeah. So they're having to swap out the mobile equipment by 2028, end of 2027.
Yeah, total swap out.
And comply with the 35% cap by 2023. They still have this big Huawei presence in the fixed line network. Huawei's has been the main sort of PON provider to them. And people
might sometimes forget that Huawei is one of the biggest.
And it was raised by the government last year. It was sort of left hanging, the decision about what to do. Now there's been a DCMS consultation going on with the industry. They've been talking to the operators, and BT was sort of wary of giving its views on it to me before. But I just asked Howard Watson on the call. He said that they're basically pushing to be allowed to keep Huawei until 2031, 2032. Yeah. Which is a longer time frame, obviously, than the mobile swap out. But if they can't, then they can't fully depreciate that equipment, so it's like an additional cost for them. And it's disruptive at a time when they're trying to build out to 25 million premises. By 2026, they don't want to have to start thinking about, we need to take Huawei equipment out. They obviously just want that. There's a cap of 35% there as well by 2023, but they're obviously not keen on that
fixed
going
as well.
for fixed.
Right.
But what they don't want is the government turning around and going, we've changed our minds. You have to remove all of its fibre equipment as well by 2028.
They're not.
So.
Well, you got a feel for BT, isn't it? Like,
yeah, totally.
You got all these politicians standing up going, we've got to be world leaders in 5G and fibre and all that sort of thing, and then on the other hand, they're sort of hamstringing them and putting all these extra cost burdens on them. So I do feel. I don't feel from that much.
Yeah,
I mean,
one of the reasons that apparently the government gave for not being tougher on fibre wasn't actually to do with security. I mean, I know people say that there's probably more security concerns about 5G than there is about fibre. I think partly because the attack surface is bigger, isn't it? If it gets used in lots of devices. But it wasn't to do with that. It was apparently because the market in the PON market's even less competitive once you take Chinese companies out than everybody goes about the RAN. Sort of oligopoly of Ericsson, Huawei, and Nokia. But if you look at PON, look at Omdia market share stats, Huawei's massive. Then you've got Nokia, and then you really don't have any. Then it's ZTE, I think, which is an option. And then there's hardly any other scale providers. Some of the companies here, people like Adtran, they're quite small. They're only about 5 or 6% sort of market share globally. And DCMS said that there aren't scale providers. So we're just going to drive a dependency on Nokia, and if we get rid of Huawei, which is.
Then you get all these
possibly changing. If you talk to Julie Kunstler, she's sort of saying there's actually new competitors coming along now. People like Adtran actually have a much bigger position in Europe than they used to, partly because it's got to deal with BT as a third vendor now, but it's big in Germany.
Adtran's been a big beneficiary of the anti-Huawei.
I think a lot of people will be, but they're a much stronger presence in Europe than they were. So.
What are you, Dario? Is there anything else jumped out at you?
I think there are maybe two additional ones. The interesting one, I think, is always Convergence. It's something we've been talking about for as long as I remember. We were getting close to it. Obviously, every person has a different definition of convergence. Ideally, it's more than just bundling commercially. It's more than just unified core. At some point, we will have the same device, whether it is a phone or a laptop or a router at home, that is concurrently using the fixed line and the mobile signals to bond. Forgive me for the inaccuracy of this word, but to bond the signal. So one day we get there. There were a few discussions yesterday, I think presentation from Deutsche Telekom, quite interesting. And this is where the market needs to get at some point. And we are moving another little step towards that. Many dependencies still, especially unified core, which is still to come to market, but it's certainly a direction that we are taking. And I think the other one, it's probably not discussed in the keynotes, but a little bit on the floor, certainly talking to vendors and operators on the floor. Let's have a second look at net neutrality and let's see how we can use the characteristic of the network that is now easier to program and manage in a way that doesn't interfere, so to speak, with the net neutrality regulation. And at the same time, there are discussions about let's have a second look at net neutrality regulation in different countries. It's happening, and let's see whether we can expand the definition of specialized services to other areas, or maybe kind of change the approach to it and give to the end user or the customer the power of managing their connections, so that we are not getting into the trap of net neutrality.
So you seem to be saying let's have a looser definition and allow more sort of specialised sort of premium services and that sort of thing, which I agree with. I think people can get far too doctrinal and dogmatic about net neutrality as if it's some kind of human right. It's still a commercial service.
Because I've seen a few stories on that recently about the UK, I think in particular. I think it came out at a recent conference in London that some of the operators were saying we need to revisit this now, especially now the UK is not in Europe and it can sort of set its own agenda. But is there a sort of, because I haven't gone through the European Union documents for a long time, but I remember looking at it when they were trying to firm up all this stuff about specialised services. It seemed incredibly hazy. I mean, is that one of the issues, that it's just not very clear what you can and
Union
can't
incredibly
do?
hazy? What are you suggesting?
It is. It is, and I think there was a recent ruling by the European Court of Justice that we were hoping it was going to define once for all what is a specialized service and what is not. But no, and we are still almost in a case-by-case scenario when we're talking about specialized services.
They do like to kick the can down the road. And that's only bureaucracy. I'll have a pop at the EU, but what I'm really having a pop at is large bureaucracies. They always end up doing stuff like that.
I'm sure the UK can mess it up as well in the next few months, couple of years.
Oh yeah, no, we're perfectly capable of that. Don't you worry. Okay, let's move it along. The next thing, which has still got a Broadband World Forum kind of theme to it. So I wrote a story about Nokia. I can't flip up my laptop because we've got the mics on it, so I'm having to just
You're gonna have to wing
delve into my senile post-50 memory to remember what I wrote. But basically, it's still a test technology, but the long and short of it is they have made the propagation characteristics of millimeter wave a lot better. So the thing about millimeter wave, as I touched on at the start, is it's a bit shy. And the reason it's a bit shy for wireless is its propagation characteristics are poor, i.e. it doesn't travel that far through the air, it's easily blocked by any obstacles. So it's just it's not at all useful, I don't think, for like mobile phones, for example. And maybe it will be one day, but for the time being, where it might be useful is a thing called fixed wireless access, which is basically a way of creating a high bandwidth point-to-point wireless connection, which kind of is a substitute for fixed line for fibre in places where it's just not viable to lay fibre, or they can't be bothered or whatever. And it stands to reason that millimeter wave, I mean, they call millimeter wave a 5G thing, all these like mid-band and millimeter wave 5G, but I don't know, I'm still not sure. I might ask you in a sec, Dario. This could just be ignorance on my part. I'm not sure if there's anything unique to 5G that enables us to use those higher frequencies. They've just been made available in the name of creating this enhanced mobile broadband, this fatter pipe. Let's just pass that to you. Is that
It's
correct understanding?
millimeter wave has been designated for 5G, well, some of it, and obviously the market is trying to make the best out of it. The reality is that, as you say, those that started off with millimeter wave didn't really move ahead because millimeter wave has a very difficult deployment scenario.
Like Verizon in the US was an example.
Like Verizon, I know you like to name and shame, but yeah. Like
I said it. You're still sitting on the fence. I said it.
So yes, millimeter wave is inevitably very, very tough. But there was a very encouraging, actually, presentation from Fastweb yesterday, which was happening just there, and they were very optimistic about the possibilities of deploying FWA using both the C-band and the millimeter wave band. It's obviously not an easy job yet because of the propagation and also because of the cost of the CPEs. Whether you want it kind of indoor or outdoor, still the issue remains. But if Nokia say that they are able to resolve some of the propagation issue of millimeter wave, that thumbs up. That is definitely removing one of the greatest probably obstacle that this market has.
If I remember rightly, the press release was a bit vague. They didn't go into specifics as to building penetration.
Press release or your memory is a bit vague?
Well, yeah, so it's double vague now.
Okay.
It was vague to start with, and now I've just vagued it up in my head. So it was almost like a sort of teaser. We've got this technology, and what they actually did to improve the characteristics didn't seem that sophisticated, because one big part of it just seemed like a brute force increase the power. I think they talked about the gain. I don't know what that means. I only know that in the sort of context of speakers or something like that. But they said they increased the gain, which I interpreted as just more brute power, which again probably means that it's good for fixed wireless access, but I don't think anyone's too keen on super-powered millimeter wave flying around into end terminals. And then they also spoke about a 360 sort of way of transmitting and receiving, which presumably you could set up like a mesh or something like that, and it's just a physical way of going around obstacles, I'm guessing. So yeah, that was the bright idea.
Whatever the solution is, which I don't know if it was vague on the press release, which I didn't read.
It was. I'm telling you,
it's definitely vague the way you describe it.
No doubt about that. That's precise for me, mate. That's me nailing it.
I'm still. I mean, as Darius says, it's good if it helps with propagation, but I don't know. You're looking at a grid in Europe that's been built on top of 2.1 gigahertz for 3G, or up to 2.6, I think is what they were using for 4G, isn't it? And some frequencies that were much lower when 2G started, and that network grid just isn't suitable for using millimeter wave at scale.
Yeah.
And so you're only ever going to have it, I think, with sort of small cell deployments in busy, even with, unless it's a massive sort of change that Nokia is talking about, which seems unlikely because you have to sort of overcome the laws of physics then. I still don't see it making I think it's good because it probably improves it in very specific scenarios, and that's probably how they're positioning it, but it's not as though we're ever going to see a nationwide millimeter wave deployment, and that actually is what Verizon seemed to be suggesting a few years ago. I mean, there was people at Barclays were coming out with reports at the time saying, well, if they're going to do it based on millimeter wave, they're going to have to spend about 300 billion to cover the whole country. I remember Deutsche Telekom
have about 1 billion small cells.
This is what it would cost to do with high frequency, spectrums.
I know. I think things like that. It's a classic example of them giving the marketing people too much rope, and they sort of ran with it, and they can come up with really sort of kick-ass bandwidth figures, and then someone goes, and that's available to how many people? And you go, well, it turns out the CEO of Verizon and his mates, and that's about it. So yes,
but nonetheless, the FWA market, 5G FWA market, which maybe 4 years ago was incredibly hyped by some of the companies you mentioned, but then we went into this is never going to happen, and now I think we are getting to a realistic position. We know there is a role to play for FWA in conjunction or instead of fiber in some places.
Or just the last mile bit. Yeah.
Last mile, or maybe last 50 meters rather than miles, but there is
Let's not overestimate its range.
but there is a role to play, absolutely.
Cool. And so you think on the whole, fixed wireless access as we speak right now is a more viable thing than you presumed a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fairly positive about it, especially in countries where the quality of the copper is so low that you will never improve it, and where the willingness to put fiber has not been there. Obviously, as we always say, if you have fiber and if you have a solid investment plan for fiber, you're not going to do millimeter wave. But millimeter wave is as we say, last mile or last very short mile.
Yeah.
And it, one of the pain points is not to bring to the fiber to the street, is what do you do from the street to the home. So that there is a chance for more usage there. And add to that kind of semi-rural areas or venues, conference centers, transport links, etc., etc. So there is definitely a place. Could be a small size, fine, or it could be a bit more kind of on the macro side, fine.
What about using, doing FWA but not using millimeter wave, using C-band spectrum?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we were both at the same trip probably in Romania a few years ago with Orange, and they were bigging up that. I think there was a similar case to what you just described, a sort of unwillingness to invest in fibre or difficulty of using fibre in parts of the country. They were talking about the opportunity for them to do an FWA rollout based on 3.5, I think.
In the meantime, they acquired the fixed line operator.
Right, okay.
So
those plans have changed.
No, not so much.
So maybe the plans have changed. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. There's the Telecom Deutschland or Telecom Romania deal, wasn't there? So, yeah.
One other little thing to throw into the mix, just something I was quickly writing up this morning before we did this pod, just a press release from Adtran that we've already mentioned. They're over there somewhere. Over there, thank you, Pierre. Is that they've launched or improved a fixed wireless access solution for 60 gigahertz.
Right.
So that's like the wrong end in terms of frequency. The higher frequency you get, the worse the propagation characteristics. But the flip side of it is also unlicensed. So I don't know the specifics of it, but the simple answer of why unlicensed is good, one of the reasons it's good, is you don't have to pay a license.
Yeah.
And so that was in their press release. There
is also another discussion which was probably we forgot to mention, but we are in a broadband conference, so a lot has been discussed about the 6 gigahertz band for Wi-Fi, which the US has entirely designated for Wi-Fi. Europe and Middle East and Africa are kind of debating to split the band, whether China is doing a completely different approach. But the 6 gigahertz band is very promising for Wi-Fi as not just a traditional way of giving your Wi-Fi router at home, but also to have services that might branch a little bit outside the home. So that is.
But is that unlicensed too?
That is unlicensed.
So that's where you get. That's the flip side of unlicensed. Yeah, you don't have to pay a license, but then you've got to fight it out with everyone else who wants some of that action.
But
and
the band they're making available is huge.
Right. So there should be space for everyone.
We should see, but there is a lot of space. Yeah. For everyone, never, but
no.
For more than the current users.
So how do they resolve it? If you've got various interested parties trying to use some unlicensed spectrum, do they all just have to have a big fight? Or what?
Well, I don't know, but that's one of the drawbacks of unlicensed.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't it?
Get out of the door and start shouting at your neighbour for using your band.
Just the biggest bloke gets it.
And
which I'm sure you already do.
Fair enough. Okay. I think we've done that more or less, haven't we? We'll move on to the final. I'll pass the ball to you, Ian. Why don't you tell us about the Google Cloud announcement earlier this week?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've had some kind of event on this week called their Next conference, maybe. I don't know if I've got that wrong, but so they've come out with loads of announcements. Really, I think there's multi-pronged the thing that they were talking about doing, with covering lots of sectors. They were talking about industries besides telecom, but I focused specifically on the bit to do with telco, which was this distributed cloud offer. So it's the idea of being able to host your, you look at a company like Dish in the US, building the 4th mobile network there, and everybody was sort of taken aback when they announced this all-in deal with AWS, with all the IT workloads and the radio functions and the core is all going to be run from from AWS sort of data centers. Well, there's a mixture of theirs and AWS data centers, and Google's. It's a similar thing, basically. It's an offer that allows you to move the. There's a big edge angle to it because you can basically take advantage of not only centres that Google owns itself. I think it has about 140 of those worldwide, but also you can use your own facilities to host, but run it off sort of things like Anthos and Kubernetes, which are the sort of management and container platforms. Or you can even sort of have it installed at an enterprise customer premises where you might co-host
or
it with
your
enterprise
own private
applications.
cloud.
Well, it's not. Yeah, it would. Yeah, it would be your facilities, but you're sort of using Google's intelligence, I guess, to
sort of Google appliances as well, because it has like these sort of.
It's like Outposts. AWS Outposts is a kind of equivalent, I think.
Is it? Oh.
But I said to them, there's a guy called Sachin Gupta who's like the head of infrastructure, I think, for Google Cloud, and I asked him, do you have, because they've got quite a lot of telecom customers out there that have announced over the last few years, Orange, Tim, I think, and I said to him, do you actually have examples of people who are, because the RAN aspect really interests me, who are running sort of RAN applications from your data centers or over your software, and he said, yeah, there are so many. He wouldn't name them specifically, but it means you have to have taken this step to virtualizing your. You have to have virtualized. It's not going to be for everybody because you can't just do it with a sort of traditional service that you buy from Ericsson and Nokia, where all the hardware and the software is sort of tightly integrated and it's usually built out of the mobile side itself. You have to have gone through that sort of virtualization step of allowing software to run on general purpose equipment, and then you can start to. So they have this. I mean, we took slightly different angles, but the thing to me is it's giving. We keep talking about the battle between hyperscalers and telcos and the role that hyperscalers play. And to me, something that there's an irony because operators are really worried about the moment about over-reliance on big RAN vendors, Ericsson, Huawei. There's even an element of that in fibre, as we talked about earlier. And yet, they don't seem to have the same concern about deals with hyperscalers. I mean, the AWS deal that Dish has done is a really big deal that will be very hard to row back in the future. You talk to analysts who know about the cloud, and you look at some of the stuff that Snapchat actually came out with in a regulatory filing not that long ago. If we had to move, because they use the cloud, big public clouds, so if we had to move from one public cloud to another, it would be, they have to put down all the risk factors, don't they, in SEC filings. It would be massively disruptive and cost a huge amount.
It's an interesting thing that when Danielle was on the pod, and obviously the theme of that pod was us pushing back on hyperscalers taking over a lot of
she agreed,
stuff. Well, she agreed, but I thought her point, her sort of, she did give more ground than I thought she would.
That is a disadvantage, but the advantages are cost savings.
Well, and that's what I was going to say.
Agility,
her ultimate point was the big expense and hassle is virtualizing everything, getting everything cloud friendly.
Yeah.
And then her assertion, which I don't know if we completely concede this point, is once you're there, it should be relatively easy to shop around.
Well,
it?
I think it depends what you're using. I mean, not according to James Crawshaw, another Omdia guy, who was saying if you're using sort of platform as a service stuff, then it's easier to move between them. But if you're taking some of the infrastructure as a service things, so things like there's certain Google tools and features that you can use that you wouldn't find in AWS, or you wouldn't find in Microsoft, or they're just different ones.
And they certainly wouldn't make it easy for them to play nice with each other.
It's not like you can sort of go from one to the other and it's all standardised and they've built a sort of something like a 5G standard for that, where theoretically, it would just be really, really hard to do. But to me, it's not just that aspect of it. It's kind of the stuff that Google was talking about. They have to certify the hardware, right, that you're using.
Yeah.
So, they have these partners that they've announced, which include Cisco, Dell, Hewlett-Packard. But it's kind of like it's almost like they're having a decision over the infrastructure that gets used. And then presumably, they didn't answer a question that I asked on this, which I sent off by email, and I didn't get a chance to answer it in a press conference. But what about, who takes responsibility for the software side of it? Because you can't just Ericsson's got this forthcoming cloud RAN offering that's coming out next year, which is done with Intel. So you run it off Intel processors. Google has Intel as a partner, as well as NVIDIA, which would be an alternative sort of platform that you can run it off. But Ericsson's software won't work on NVIDIA. right? I mean,
Right.
and the answer for that is that we can't support all platforms from day one. So who takes responsibility for that process of, you couldn't just say to Google, well, here you go, here I want to use Ericsson's, software, and you're someone has to play that sort of integrator role, don't they?
And increasingly the hyperscalers seem keen on doing even that. They seem to want to do as much as possible.
That's the job that was done by Ericsson and Nokia when you're just buying an integrated service. They worry about all of that. They worry about which chip processor they're going to use. They worry about which software they're going to use and who their suppliers are. But it seems like Google's going to be playing that role. Yeah, Google's the guy that certifies the hardware. It's the one that has to make sure the software runs on that hardware. And if they've got a great ecosystem of partners and all the options and all the bases are covered, then maybe it's not such a worry. I don't know, but it's a big responsibility they're taking.
I mean, definitely Google is playing catch up with AWS and Microsoft. So possibly one of the ways for them to demonstrate that they could be the partner of choice is to be to reassure service providers that this vendor lock-in is not going to happen. But then we know kind of the lock-in is something that service providers only realize later on.
When they try to clear off
after it happened. But on your point, Ian, you mentioned the service providers are growing in every single direction. There is an interesting stats from this year, which is when we look at the service providers all together, or kind of 800 plus in mobile and thousands in fixed line, combined revenue of all of them is just short of 2 trillion.
Wow.
This year, for the first time, the hyperscale software world, let's say the big tech world, the top 40 companies, will surpass in size the size of the telecom market. So this is the first time in the technology history the tech platform world is becoming bigger than the telco world. And not only that, the tech platform world, the top 40 will surpass the 2,000 plus service providers combined in revenue terms. It's quite indicative of where the market is going, the capability of capitalizing on what we mentioned before, this transition to digital. Service providers just about during the pandemic, just about managed to keep their revenue line flat or slightly growing, 1-2%. Hyperscaler plus 15, plus 20, massive jump. And the final on that is that obviously service providers have capital intensity of around about 20%, where the tech world has a capital intensity of less than 10%.
Wow.
Which is indicative that they are way more efficient
in what they're spending. It's still as a percentage. I mean the Google thing's interesting. I think just because of we've talked about this before. Just the role that they're playing on the services side as well, and this comes back to the can telcos be techcos? A lot of these edge partnerships that are getting announced, the sort of thing that Vodafone's been talking about in the UK recently with AWS, I think, where they're talking about providing a low latency service, I think, for certain types of application. I mean, there haven't been that many examples of services at the moment, have there? But I don't know, it's a battle, I think, that I don't know if it is a battle, if that's the right way to frame it. Maybe it could work out in a way that sort of partnership is mutually beneficial, but you sort of feel the sort of the value element of it is one that the hyperscalers are better positioned to take advantage of, and there's a risk that all the operators end up doing is just being the pipe provider.
But edge was definitely a big theme of the Google announcement, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, but it's a different type of edge. It's hosting your RAN functions in your cloud at the edge. It's not. They weren't so much talking about. Well, there might have been an angle of that, but I didn't focus on that. They weren't so much talking about using. The thing that Vodafone and AWS is doing is running IT applications from the edge that you then provide to customers. Yeah, there's a big example of a sports company that might have a need for the need to sort of take information that happens on a pitch and process it really quickly. So you want all the kind of clever IT resource stuff actually at the stadium rather than closer to the stadium.
When you, as you say, like when you look at where the market is going, step one of big tech or hyperscale operators is at the very least to become telco vendors.
Yeah.
It's very clear. So they are an additional vendor, very specialized and coming from a completely different angle, but they are absolutely a telco vendor at the moment. Now the question mark is, where is next? We don't know yet, but for sure we can now assimilate them to any other vendor.
Well, it's that sort of creep. I mean, when Google first came along 20 years, whenever that was, it was a better search engine than the stuff that was there. I don't think anyone anticipated it getting involved in quite as much stuff as it is now. And then, a big theme that came up again. The BT was talking about this. All the stuff that's supposed to come with 5G, especially the B2B stuff, the getting into verticals as we call them. I just call them other industries. If people like Google and AWS are sort of behaving in this SI way that you describe, and they're taking more and more of the sort of technological burden, presumably that puts them in a really strong position or perhaps a stronger position than telcos to exploit all these new verticals and these new B2B things and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other thing I wanted to say as well is that it's having quite a big impact on other, and the real losers from this are probably not at this stage the telcos, but the companies that sell server equipment and the companies that do private cloud stuff, like sort of Red Hat, which is owned by IBM now, or VMware, and people like Dell and Hewlett-Packard, because they would have previously have sold their server equipment for use in private clouds to a wide range of customers. If this mushrooms and carries on going this way, then they'll only be selling to AWS, Google, and Microsoft. And I mean, James Crawshay was saying that the margins on that are probably not what they could have earned from
economies of scale.
So yeah.
I know we're all in, and I thought it was telling in the Google press release. So I didn't attend the conference like you did, but did read through the press release or the blog, which is by the same bloke who did the call. Everyone's got shout outs. All these hardware vendors got shout outs. Nokia and
they have to
Ericsson have got shout outs. So yeah, exactly. So to your point, it's like, it might not be great for them, but what's their alternative?
Exactly.
And that's a bit back to Danielle's point that she made on the pod, which is I concede there are these downsides, but what else are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, like Cloud RAN, the thing that Ericsson's got coming out next year, which is basically running their baseband software on Intel x86 processors, it's not really that great a thing for. I mean, they almost acknowledged this when I interviewed the guy who was sort of leading Per Narvinger, I think he's called. He's head of product area sales, but it's like, they would previously have sold the whole thing, the hardware and the software, and have, they're now just basically selling software on top of an Intel sort of hardware platform. So, but if they don't do it, the customers are going to go, well, we'll go and buy stuff from Mavenir instead then, or whatever, and so they can still sell the radio units.
Yeah, they've all got that.
I mean, we've been saying for 20 years software is eating the world, right?
Yeah.
And it's happening in telecom. It's inevitable, and it's something that doesn't always add value to the entire industry. Sometimes it just kind of absorbs some value into the software maker, and the others left shortchanged.
Yep.
It happens over and over and over again, and there's no reason why it would not happen again in the telco equipment market.
This might be a slightly sort of forced comparison, but it was when with software forcing the commoditization of hardware, when the emphasis on software, as we might see like with Open RAN, for example, it makes me think of sort of Apple versus PCs. And one of the reasons that Apple's margins are so much greater is because it's got this closed system, this thing that we're supposed to hate in the form of the big kit vendors and all that sort of thing. But it's got this closed system, everything's sort of Apple certified, all the software is nice and integrated and all that sort of thing, and you buy the complete thing, and as a consumer, you knowingly pay a premium because you think it's better. I might argue a toss as to whether it is, but I can't argue with Apple's numbers. And that's what it makes me think of. Does that seem like a viable comparison?
It's a good analogy.
Cool. Well, on that note,
disagree with you.
On that note, I'm going to quit while I'm ahead, I think. Thank you very much for joining us, Dario. It's great to have you here. And and thank you for listening. And make sure you join us for the next one.